It started with a smile, a couple once pictured on yachts, sipping cocktails under the Mexican sun. Days later, a body found in a Manchester townhouse, tortured and the walls painted red. No signs of forced entry, no obvious motive, just one woman who knew too much, and a seance that changed everything. This is the story of Thomas and Colleen Campbell, and how a secret world came crashing down. They looked like the kind of couple who had made it. Matching blacked-out cars on the drive, a freshly built home extension with mosaic floors and a private gym in the garden. Designer clothes, luxury watches, and holidays most families only dream of. In public, Thomas Campbell was a personal trainer. Colleen worked part-time at Matalan. They were often seen taking their kids to school, showing off sun-soaked photos from Cancun, Mallorca, and Sharm el-Sheikh. One trip alone cost £10,000 in cash. But the truth was buried deep in cash. Dirty cash, the kind that doesn't go near banks. Between 2012 and 2016, they funneled drug money through car finance agreements and property upgrades. Flash vehicles, BMWs, Audis, and a 6.3-litre Mercedes AMG all were registered to their names. Both sides of the family were involved, parents, siblings, and cousins, all part of a low-key criminal web designed to hide wealth in plain sight. By 2018, it caught up with them. A joint police operation led to both being charged with concealing criminal property. Colleen avoided prison. Thomas didn't. He served 2 years. When he came out, the marriage was finished. She stayed in the house. He moved on. New partner, new routines, same old secrets. But something had shifted. What was once a united front had fractured into bitterness, jealousy, and quiet rage. To neighbors, they were still just a broken couple trying to co-parent, but inside the circles they once controlled, loyalties had started to slide. And someone else, someone outside the family, had started paying close attention to Thomas's every move. That attention would soon turn into something else entirely. Thomas had barely settled into his new life when word started to spread. He was seeing someone new, and in the world he moved in, one fueled by drugs, revenge, and old loyalties that mattered a lot. Because the woman he'd started seeing had history. Her ex was John Belfield, a name whispered in certain circles, linked to organized crime and heavy supply lines of Class A drugs. Not just a rival, a reasonable threat. Belfield didn't take it quietly. On the surface, he played it smart. Behind closed doors, and soon after hearing of the relationship, he began plotting. Not in anger, but in a very professional way. He wanted to hurt Thomas and take whatever cash, drugs, or valuables he could in the process. It started with a message. Belfield contacted Colleen Campbell through Instagram. Until then, they'd never spoken. But something clicked. Over the next few days, they shared 68 messages and 35 calls. Prosecutors said Belfield used her. Others said she knew exactly what she was doing. Colleen began feeding him key details. The van Thomas drove, his house number, where he'd be at specific times. A tracker was discussed, but we will talk about this in a while. To the outside world, it looked like old friends reconnecting, but police would later recover footage of Belfield and Colleen, a 25-minute meeting in her back garden, just a day before Thomas died. The plot had begun. The target had been selected. All that remained was the right moment to strike. And that moment came on the evening of July 2nd. In the days leading up to the murder, the planning intensified. June 27th, just 5 days before the attack, Belfield, Cleworth, and Stephen met at the Boat and Horses pub in Oldham. CCTV captured the trio sitting at a table. What looked like casual conversation was something else entirely. One of them moved his hand under the table, mimicking how to fit a tracker to a vehicle. Later that day, the device was fitted. It was small, discreet, and stuck beneath Thomas's van while he waited to collect his daughter from school. A quiet operation, one that let them trace his movements without ever being seen. With the tracker in place, the surveillance began. Thomas had no idea. Every trip he made, every stop, every return home, they were all logged. Colleen, prosecutors said, gave context to the data. When he'd be out, when he'd be alone, when the front door would open. On June 30th, the gang pulled up outside his house, but they aborted. Something wasn't right. It wasn't time. 2 nights later, they came back. 3 men. A Vauxhall combo van. Parked on a neighbouring drive just after 11 p.m. CCTV from the street would later show them waiting, silent inside the parked vehicle. They weren't dressed for robbery. No demands were shouted, no weapons shown until the moment they moved. The plan wasn't to break in, it was to wait, to watch, and to pounce the second Thomas opened the door. At 11:06 p.m, he did. What followed inside the house, the violence would last for nearly 2 hours. But it all began here, on a quiet street in Mossley, with a door left unlocked and 3 shadows moving fast toward it. Before we move toward the 2 hours of violence that ended Thomas Campbell's life, we need to rewind to a moment prosecutors would later use as a sign of what was coming. It happened on June 29th, just 3 days before the murder. Colleen Campbell was caught on CCTV in Ashton-under-Lyne, striding across a residential street with a claw hammer in her hand. In the footage, she moves quickly, no attempt to hide. One woman, connected to her ex's wider circle, is struck with the weapon before Colleen turns and walks away. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't random. It was personal. A flare-up in a long tangled dispute involving jealousy, reputation, and shifting alliances. At the time, police filed it as a standalone assault, but during the murder trial, it was brought back into the frame. Prosecutors argued it showed Colleen's mindset, that she wasn't just a bitter ex, she was volatile, active, and capable of direct violence. Someone who would lash out without hesitation. The hammer never made it into the murder scene, but the mentality, the readiness to escalate, to strike first, carried forward. By that stage, she'd already been in contact with John Belfield, already shared key details. Now, she was attacking people on the street in broad daylight. To the outside world, it still looked like she was grieving, a mother raising children alone. But in the shadows, she was aligning herself with a plan. And the man she once shared a life with was now in real danger. The first strike came the moment the door opened. Thomas Campbell barely had time to speak before he was pulled inside. The door slammed shut. Lights stayed off. No neighbors saw anything. For the next 2 hours, he was held in his own home, stripped, restrained, and attacked in almost total silence. What happened inside that house was brutal by any standard. Thomas suffered 61 separate injuries. He was punched, stamped on, and stabbed. At one point, boiling water was poured over his buttocks and legs, a form of punishment long associated with gang retribution. Police later described it as a prolonged, targeted assault designed to inflict pain. He was dragged from room to room, marks left on the floor with almost no chance of survival. When paramedics arrived, they found him naked except for a pair of socks. His home, once filled with luxury fittings and polished floors, had become a crime scene soaked in blood. But there were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no alarm raised, just one neighbor's doorbell cam, capturing a brief glimpse of the men as they stepped inside. Whoever had done this had known exactly how to get close and exactly when to strike. The killers took nothing of value, no cash, no jewelry, not even the designer items laid out in plain sight. This wasn't about robbery. It was about humiliation, pain, and dominance. Forensics would later confirm multiple attackers, different DNA, different shoe prints, overlapping patterns of violence. But none of them spoke a word during the assault. By the time Thomas was declared dead at the scene, the attackers were already gone. No vehicle was seen leaving, no witnesses came forward. Just a man left dead in his hallway. and a silence that would only be broken days later by someone who claimed he'd spoken from beyond the grave. 4 days after Thomas's murder, his mother answered a knock at the door. Standing outside was Colleen Campbell. She said she'd seen a psychic, claimed she'd been visited by Thomas during a séance, and that he had things to tell her. What followed was a detailed account of the attack. Colleen spoke about boiling water, facial injuries, the number of men involved. She even mimicked a cut across the cheek as she spoke. Claimed Thomas had told her everything, through the psychic. His mother listened, but something didn't sit right. Those injuries weren't public, not the boiling, not the slashes, not the number of attackers. Only detectives and killers would know what Thomas had suffered. She ended the conversation and went straight to the police. That moment became critical. Investigators checked the timeline. By then, Colleen's phone had already been flagged. Data showed contact with John Belfield on the night of the murder. Messages and calls, some exchanged just hours after Thomas was declared dead. Colleen's version, that she'd learned it all from a psychic, began to fall apart. What she claimed was spiritual turned out to be forensic. What she passed off as otherworldly insight was, in fact, the raw evidence. In court, prosecutors argued that the séance story was never about grief. It was a cover, a deflection, a way of explaining how she knew what no one else could have, because she hadn't heard it from a ghost, but from one of the men who was there. The silence didn't last long. Behind the scenes, Greater Manchester Police had already launched a full-scale investigation. They called it Operation Ravensburg, and it would uncover a network of surveillance, planning, and collusion stretching back weeks. Over 200 witnesses were interviewed. More than 3,000 exhibits were logged. CCTV was pulled from street corners, shop fronts, even neighboring houses. Hours of footage were analyzed frame by frame. They traced the Vauxhall combo van, located the pub meeting days earlier, matched times, movements, and mobile signals. Every call Colleen made to Belfield, every message, every location ping, it all began to slot into place. Footage from Colleen's own home showed her and Belfield in the garden that we discussed earlier, just two people deep in discussion, under cover of darkness. Elsewhere, the tracker told its own story, attached with care and positioned to avoid detection, logging routes in and out of Thomas's home for days. And Colleen had given context to every signal. Even after the murder, Colleen stayed in contact with Belfield. A final call came just hours after Thomas's body was found. All of it pointed to a joint plan. The first arrest came within days. Reese Stephen, 29, was picked up after forensic teams linked his DNA to a VW Caddy van believed to be used during the getaway. Officers tracked him to a Manchester address. He was arrested on suspicion of murder. Next came Stephen Cleworth, 38. He was detained in Haywood after CCTV and phone records placed him at key planning meetings, including the one at the Boat and Horses pub. His role in the early stages of the plot was enough to bring him in. Then, police turned their attention to Colleen Campbell. She was arrested at her home in Clayton, Greater Manchester. Her contact with John Belfield had drawn a clear line. Combined with what she told Thomas's mother after the séance, it was enough. Each arrest added a new layer to the investigation, but one figure remained missing. By the time the others were charged, John Belfield had disappeared. Police moved fast, raiding properties across Greater Manchester and beyond. But Belfield was already gone. No phone signal, no trace. Just whispers, a fake passport, burner phones, and help from people still loyal to him. He wasn't just another name in the case. Detectives believed he had planned every detail: the surveillance, the ambush, the method of attack. He'd chosen the men, directed the timing, even controlled the cleanup. And yet, when the arrests were made, Belfield slipped through the net. A European arrest warrant was issued. Border alerts flagged his profile. Interpol added him to their wanted list. But still, nothing. Meanwhile, back in the UK, the Crown built its case without him. Prosecutors laid out the evidence: From the tracker on Thomas's van to the phone data linking Colleen to Belfield. For a while, it looked like he might be right. But in the summer of 2023, over a year after Thomas was killed, a breakthrough came. Belfield had fled to Suriname, a small country on South America's northeast coast. He was arrested by local authorities and taken into custody under a fake name. For months, he remained locked in a cell 4,500 miles away. Then, in June 2025, John Belfield was finally returned to the UK. Greater Manchester Police confirmed his arrival. His long absence was over, and the case was no longer frozen. He now faces charges for his alleged role in planning and ordering the killing. Proceedings are expected to resume in the coming weeks, with Belfield set to stand trial alone. On July 12, 2023, at Bolton Crown Court, the trial of 3 defendants came to an end. The charges were murder, manslaughter, and conspiracy to rob. The prosecution laid out a case built on weeks of surveillance footage, phone records, and forensic analysis. They argued that this was not a burglary gone wrong. It was a calculated ambush. They told the jury about each evidence that came across while investigating, and we have already discussed. And I'm not going into those details again. The attack, they said, was carried out with military precision and with clear knowledge passed from Colleen Campbell, the toxic ex of the victim. Rhys Stephen, they said, had entered the house alongside 2 others. Doorbell footage confirmed that 3 men followed Thomas through the door. Once inside, all 3 had a direct participant in the torture leading up to the murder. In response, the defense tried to draw lines between planning and violence. Colleen claimed she believed it was a robbery, that no one intended for Thomas to be killed. Cleworth insisted he wasn't present when the murder took place. Only Rhys Stephen offered no defense at all. The jury rejected all of their claims, then returned their verdicts. Rhys Stephen, 29, was found guilty of murder and conspiracy to rob. He received a life sentence with a minimum term of 37 years. Stephen Cleworth, 38, was convicted of manslaughter and conspiracy to rob. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Colleen Campbell, 38, was found guilty of manslaughter and conspiracy to rob. The judge described her as the one who set the ball rolling. She was sentenced to 13 years in prison and must serve at least 2/3 before she can be considered for release. As sentencing was delivered, one figure remained outside the courtroom. But not anymore. Soon he too will face justice. What did you make of the case and the sentences handed down? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. As for John Belfield, the case remains ongoing. A trial will determine what comes next. If you want more real UK crime stories like this, subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us. There's always another case to uncover.